Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to breakout session number 2, and thank you for joining us at the USI Social Work Conference. A brief reminder, this session is being recorded and will be made available online only to USI students in the social work program. As a friendly reminder, if you need to obtain your CEUs from today, an evaluation link will be sent to your email today. Complete your evaluation and request your earned CEs, and you will receive your CE certificate via email within the next 30 days. For breakout session number 2, we're very happy to welcome Robin Miller, LCSW, ACSW, in her presentation on the Neurosequential model, part 2, a continuation of her presentation this year. Robin Miller is the Director of Practicum Education and a Clinical Assistant Professor of Social Work at Purdue University Northwest, and she is returning this year to continue presenting about Purdue's work with Neurosequential model for therapeutics. Round of applause, Robin Miller.
Thank you. I can't see you very well, but I'm just wondering, how many of you were in my presentation last year? A handful of you? Okay, I think that I'm going to work to provide some context for those of you that weren't there, just to explain a little bit about what the neurosequential model of therapeutics is, but I'm also going to present a case where I've actually used the model to do an assessment and generate a metric, and I've brought an actual metric with the name redacted to share with you today so you can kind of see what that looks like. I left the clicker over here. Okay, so essentially the neurosequential model of therapeutics is a way to clinically conceptualize a client by doing a developmental assessment that's based in neuroscience. It takes into consideration the timing of adversity, along with relational health. Participants do learn about major areas of the brain. I need my glasses. And appreciate the sequential nature of brain development. So last year when we talked about this model, we were talking about brain development, and the brain develops from the bottom, most primitive functions, kind of keep us alive functions, from bottom up to the smartest, most complex areas of brain development that have to do with problem solving, creativity, abstract thinking, values, things like that. And so what this assessment essentially does is looks at what parts of the brain were developing when that person, that child, experienced adversity. And we know that that affects not only the brain, but other functions of the central nervous system, and then has a trickle-up effect, right? So as higher parts of the brain are developed, those lower parts remain undeveloped, and that just does then impact the sequential nature of brain development. Also considered, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, is that there are relational buffers that people have in their lives, whether that's parents or other caregivers or other supportive adults in their lives, that can, as the term indicates, do buffer those experiences of adversity. Can you? Okay. So I'm not sure what that looks like. So that's going to be just sort of fuzzy right now, but you'll see that those are elements of the metric report that are generated. And I'm going to show you a report in its entirety. I've just kind of taken out little pieces, and these aren't necessarily my clients' pieces. These are images I pulled from online. So when you're going through this clinical practice tool or metric, there is once you're certified in this process, you have access to an online kind of dashboard app where you input information about developmental functioning. So in part A, we look at genetic factors, things that are known about that child's development. And I've actually done one of these metrics on myself. So you can do them on adults, but they really do take into consideration the period of time that the brain is developing, so through early adulthood. It also takes into consideration epigenetic factors. And those are factors that influence genes being turned on or turned off without impacting the overall DNA sequence. So those are things like diet, stress, environmental toxins, and things like that. And they can, we know this through research that those things can be passed down to future generations. Part A also takes into consideration adverse experiences. So the specific-ish developmental timing when those adversities take place. And those are going to be things like obvious traumatic events, but also like exposure to chaos and lots of transitions, that can have an impact on the brain and central nervous system's development. So we look at not only the kind of the window in which those experiences happened, but the nature of them. So what kinds of things were happening? Was this like ritualistic abuse? Was this exposure to domestic violence? Was this, just depending on what the nature of that adverse experience was. So we look at also the severity of it and the pattern. So is this a one-time encounter? And I don't mean to minimize a one-time, traumatizing event, but there is a difference on the impact of a one-time, very severe traumatic experience, a one-time or multi incidents of very severe traumatic events. So those will have somewhat of a different impact on overall. Yep. Part B, sorry, Chris, back one more, I missed a part. Part B really takes into consideration relational health. So bonding and attachment, and that is evaluated at each developmental stage also. Family supports and community supports. Thanks. Part C really looks at central nervous system functioning. So starting at the bottom with the brainstem, moving up to the diencephalon, on up to the limbic system, and then to the cortex and frontal cortex. And we'll talk about that in some detail, but just as a little introduction, these upside down triangles are the brain broken up into boxes, and the brainstem would be at the bottom, the cortex and frontal cortex at the top. But I think it'll make more sense when we're talking about a specific case example. And then part D is their current relational health. So like what supports does that person have happening around them now in terms of family, in terms of their acceptance by their peers, community, school support, things like that. So before we get into the case example, I wanted to just share some key concepts that some ideas you may already be familiar with, but some might just be a helpful way to think about people and how they behave and how they respond to stress. So one of the key concepts of this model is the sequence of engagement. And essentially, if we're interacting with somebody who's dysregulated, first of all, we have to get ourselves regulated because a dysregulated adult can never help regulate any other person, right? So first we have to be regulated. But then we have to help that person regulate, and then we need to relate to them before we can reason with them. And that's because regulation settles those lower parts of the brain so that they have access, relational supports and encouragement and acceptance, settle those middle parts of the brain, which gives a person access to their cortex. So I'm going to use my hands. I don't need that. So if the brain is an upside-down triangle, if somebody is dysregulated, they do not have access to the top part of their brain. They do not have the ability to to reason with you? Why did, so, but as adults, even interacting with other adults, but particularly with children, if a child does something and they're having a temper tantrum and they do a bad behavior, right? We're going to, why didn't you use your coping skills? Right? Why didn't you do that? What led you to make that choice? They don't have access to be able to engage with you in that way. So the expectations that we have about the capacity of a person to access those problem-solving parts of their brain are not realistic. But if we can take a few moments to regulate, to relate with them, we can get them to a place where they can access it. And quite honestly, sometimes when kids or adults even are so dysregulated, by the time we get them regulated and we're relating to them, they might not even remember, because they were not in that smart part of their brain. I can take questions along the way, or we can wait till the end. Are we going all right? Okay. Okay. And, oh, no, sorry. This one's good. Oh, is it working now? Okay, here, I'll take it. Okay, thank you. Okay, the next, another key concept, and I just picked out a few that I thought might be helpful, is the pattern of stress. And so you'll see here that, when someone experiences unpredictable, extreme, prolonged stress, that leads to sensitization. And what that really means is they will have a sensitized stress response system. So they may, because they're, and I'll show you another slide that's going to help you, I think, illustrate that better than I can articulate it with my words. But it does lead to a vulnerability because they're going to have low tolerance, high reactivity due to that the nature of the stress that they experienced. On the other hand, if they experience predictable, moderate, controllable stress, that's what leads to the ability to tolerate stressful situations and is actually the central nervous system's way to lead us to resilience. So I want you to kind of just bear this in mind. No, I'm gonna get it. I'm hitting the right button. Oh, there, got it? It's blocking, okay. So this is what I wanted this relates to the previous slide very closely. So you'll see on the left-hand side, different states, right? So from calm to terror. And then at the bottom, the kind of degrees of stress. So baseline would be kind of like, your everyday bebopping along, not really, you just encounter maybe traffic or you encounter, whatever, technical problem. But then you might, and further on down that bottom line is, higher degrees of stress. So, and this is just intended as an illustrated version, not intended to be like putting anybody in boxes. But if somebody is fairly neurotypical and they have experienced that kind of stress that leads to tolerance, they're going to experience the escalation of that stress. I'm probably going the wrong way for you, right? So it's going to take something extreme stress to get them up to that terror state. Whereas somebody who has really developed done a lot of, has a lot of insight, has a lot of coping skills, has a lot of support, maybe low trauma, like very little trauma history, they're going to be in that more resilient line. And so you can see how much more they can tolerate before their experience of stress becomes very high. And then the top line, you can see how somebody who's sensitized or somebody who's been exposed to extreme, prolonged, unpredictable stress, how their degree of tolerance, so they go from like a mildly stressful situation, which is experienced much more mildly by the other two groups. This group gets up into that fear and terror state much more easily. And so I'm going to preempt a couple of slides ahead here by saying an important way to think about people is know the stage, watch the state. So know where they really are developmentally, not chronologically, but where they are developmentally, and have an understanding of what kind of state they are in. And when I talk about state, I'm talking about on the left-hand side. So that prolonged stress can also impact their tolerance of intimacy. Got it? So this is a key concept called the intimacy barrier. So on the left, you'll see this is the history of relational interactions. So if they've typically had negative, volatile interactions with caregivers, you can see the red-brained, angry-faced kind of caregiver holding the child that's experiencing that, like in a distressful way, versus on the bottom, you see the green brain where, you know, they're being attended to, they're being soothed, they feel loved and cared for. So that's one thing to kind of note on this image. But on the right, you'll see, you know, kind of different equations of the kinds of experiences they've had with caregivers in terms of intimacy and connection, attachment, bonding. So if they have had more negative than positive, like in that top bubble, their ability to tolerate closeness, right? And thinking of closeness as in like casual interactions, routine, like shaking a hand, right? Personal might be like stepping into somebody's personal space a little bit. And intimate would be like, you know, giving somebody a hug or whispering in their ear. So their ability to tolerate a handshake, for example, is going to be very threatening, as opposed to somebody who hasn't had those same traumatic experiences. And then the inverse is true, obviously, if you have more positive experiences than negative experiences. So think about a child who is abused or neglected by their primary caregivers. And as we know, and this is no offense to any DCS workers who might be here, but you know, oftentimes children can be placed in a foster home and that doesn't work out for whatever reason, and they can be moved multiple times, right? And so that child experiences confusion about smells, about what the schedule is like, what the routine is like, how they're cared for, how they're responded to. And so that creates this, that's one example of what can lead to this kind of confusion with the intimacy barrier. Are you giving me something else?
Now you can use it out there.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So when I was talking about know the stage and watch the state, I'm just going to take a moment and let you look at this because there's a lot of words on here, but I think this is really important and can be really helpful in how we think about people. So again, when we talk about the state, the mental state, that's those same words going along the bottom. You with me? Okay. The next line up is depending on what state they're in, what degree of cognition they're actually capable of. So if somebody's calm, they can think creatively, right? They can problem solve, right? But as they become into like arousal, even the next step, it just leads to like very concrete, black and white. They don't have access to that part of their brain. We make an assumption because you look like an adult, right, that you are capable of all the things that are now fully developed in your cortex and frontal cortex. You should be able to get it together, right? But depending on what mental state we're in, that is going to affect the way we function. So if somebody is in terror, think about, too, that like kind of leaf-shaped diagram. somebody who maybe has a very sensitized stress response gets up into that fear and terror like much more quickly, right? So if they're in that fear or terror, their cognition is only reflexive. They're functioning in their lizard brain. So their only function their brain has access to in that mental state is maintaining their heart rate, keeping them breathing, like keeping them alive. Like no thinking. So then we get up into that third row up, which just identifies what are the primary and secondary brain areas that they have access to. And then, the next two lines, so there's this idea that, everybody dissociates, right? And everybody can also overreact to things. So there's a continuum of dissociation, right? From coma to kind of just like spacing out and daydreaming. And there's all these different degrees of dissociation in between. When it comes to hyperarousal, you could be a little irritated, you could be a little agitated, or you can be like in a full-blown meltdown. And depending on your trauma history, you can have a tendency to kind of fall into one of those two kinds of continuums. Not that you won't visit both of them, right? But you might have a tendency to respond in a particular way. So I think that when you're just kind of getting oriented to this idea, it can be helpful to kind of look at those two rows because that's behavior, right? And that's like what we can see. So if somebody's like being very compliant, right? They're probably on that dissociative continuum. That might tell us that they're just in that alarm state. Does that make sense to you? I can't see you. Thank you. Okay. And on the inverse, if they are being very resistant, that would be another indicator that they were kind of in that alarm state and so forth. There's another table. I just couldn't find it without taking my attention away from a lot of other things I had to get together. But there's another table just like this that has another row at the top that indicates functional IQ. There is a correspondence between functional IQ and the state that you're in. So if somebody's like really distressed and really dysregulated and they are experiencing very intense fear and they have to go take their SAT, right? They're going to score much lower than they might if they were in a calm state. Okay, so I'm gonna switch. No, I'm gonna go through some slides and then I'm gonna switch to show you the report. I want to just say that I have changed my client's name and any identifying information to protect his confidentiality. But so I'm sharing with you Simeon, 23 years old. Okay, so he has, I probably put too many words on this screen, so just forgive me, but he has a diagnosis of a genetic disorder called hereditary spastic paraplegia. And so essentially what that means is he experiences a lot of muscle weakness. It is a progressive disease, and so essentially, to break it down, he has become gradually more and more paralyzed. Primarily from the waist down, but it also has affected some of his speech, the muscles in his mouth, and also then, as a result, some swallowing problems. He has utilized a wheelchair. No, he does utilize a wheelchair, and he uses a modified ventilator at night. That is because the muscle strength in his abdomen, when we breathe in and we breathe out, we get rid of those toxins, right, that carbon dioxide. Well, his muscles are so weak that the carbon dioxide doesn't expel fully. And it was discovered a few years ago that that was kind of poisoning him. He was really sick, having terrible headaches. So this modified ventilator doesn't go here. It's something he wears on his face that pushes air in. It's very intense. So he was adopted. Now, I'm going to confuse you by this person. He was adopted by his maternal great aunt. And I know sometimes I talk about her as his aunt, and sometimes I talk about him as his mom. But I just want you to know, first of all, I'll try to keep that clear. But I really think that she's an angel that walks among us. Like, she has dedicated her life and has sacrificed a lot of things in her life to take care of him. And so she really is a tremendously powerful relational buffer for Simeon. So she did adopt him when he was 18, and I think the reason for that will become clear, but she raised him pretty much throughout his whole life. His biological mother has struggled with polysubstance abuse and addiction since really before pregnancy. She's currently attends a methadone clinic every day and is not using any opiates outside of that methadone. Biofather he also struggled with substance addiction. He died 2 years ago in a motor vehicle accident. Simeon has one older brother who was placed for adoption at birth, so shared the biological parents, and Simeon doesn't know where he is, although he has tried to find him. He's really curious about whether or not he got that same genetic disorder, because in his family, he's the only one that he knows that has that hereditary spastic paraplegia, which we call HSP. Simeon has 2 younger half-siblings, one from bio mom, one from bio dad. And I will say that the biological parents have really been in and out of his life very inconsistently, and that's been very distressing for him. And I would say, so I am Simeon's therapist, and I see him at his home because of navigating, his mobility issues. And I've worked with him. He's probably the longest standing client that I'm currently working with, just because there have been so many complications. And as a result, so I worked with him when he was still a minor. And as a result of working with him for so long, I've really gotten to know his adoptive mother very well. And certainly when he was younger, there was a lot of collaboration about parenting and how to help him navigate some of the challenges that he was facing. And I'll just say this before I click on to the next slide. So his adoptive mother, right, his great aunt, did help kind of raise his biological mother. So she kind of, from when she was preteen, lots of generational trauma in this family on both sides. But she has kind of been, I don't know how she managed to, she didn't escape, she didn't, grow up unscathed, but she has just been kind of a solid person, And, but she is a little bit vulnerable to the biological mother because she has this emotional attachment. And I would say that, from a clinical perspective, that was a challenging issue for us to navigate, because I often would encourage more clear boundaries, and I think you'll see why going forward. But she just has a soft spot. I think she's getting there now, but it's just taken a really long time. So we're going to go through each developmental stage as I collect it, as I input information. So you start with the assessment at the intrauterine stage. And so I'll just tell you some of the things that were happening there that we kind of know about. And I'll tell you that when you're doing this kind of an assessment with clients, they're not going to know what the heck was going on when their mother was pregnant with them, right? But they're going to be able to kind of give it a good guess. They've heard stories. They kind of, and so there's a way to score if you just have absolutely no information, but you kind of are encouraged to do sort of a clinical reconstruction of what was likely to have been happening based on what the client knows. So during the time that he was in vitro, there was domestic violence, drug and alcohol exposure, unstable housing. The father was arrested a number of times. Both parents were unemployed, and bio mother stayed sometimes with her maternal aunt, the one who is the adoptive mother of Simeon. So a lot of chaos, right? And we know that even in vitro, exposure to domestic violence impacts, right, the mother's stress response, which we know then impacts that fetus's developing baby's stress response. So then we look at the perinatal period. So in the first 2 months of Simeon's life, father was in a serious car accident. They thought he might die. He was being left by his biological mother, like buckled into a bouncy seat for like extended periods of time. Because of her substance abuse, she was very inattentive, and there was a lot of conflict going on between bio mom and bio dad, but even more so between bio mom and the aunt at the time, right, who became the adoptive mother, because they were arguing about the quality of care that bio mom was providing for Simeon. In infancy, so between the 3 and 12 months, again, continued unstable housing, exposure to substance abuse, ongoing neglectful parenting. At 10 months old, bio mother called Child Protective Services on herself to say, I just can't take care of this child. CPS called the aunt, said, you be here you have 2 hours to come pick up this little boy or he's going into foster care. She dropped everything that she was doing and went and got him. And both biological parents signed off temporary guardianship. So DCS was then able to close that case, and they didn't remain involved. So that was in his first year of life, she was granted that temporary guardianship. Between 13 and 48 months, they agreed during this period of time to give her permanent guardianship, so to take away that temporary status. With guardianship, that can always be revoked, but they gave her permanent guardianship. The aunt started seeing significant developmental delays, like he couldn't roll over.